Hello, good afternoon. My name is Xavier Gavarrey. I be the chairman of the session, the third session, driver session, called Mobility Behaviors. We have two exciting presentations, two speakers, one now in Malmo and the second one in Paris. So the first, Sarah Ostrom, is a PhD student in Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. Her PhD is part of the formal research project. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. So I will present here today some ongoing work. So this is a study that I am working on together with Johannes Strippler from Political Science in Lund and Kimberly Nicholas, also from Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. So in this study, we are analyzing how narratives of holiday air travel have changed in Sweden since the 1950s to present time. And we focus particularly on the recent emergence of a movement to reduce flying and the ways in which this movement is contributing to changing narratives of aviation, climate change, and leisure experiences. So I will start with some background to why we are focusing on air travel or reducing air travel as a lifestyle change. And as of today, air travel contributes to climate change by roughly 5%, and emissions from air travel are expected to increase. And to meet climate goals, reducing air travel is absolutely necessary. And in a study from 2017, Seth Waynes and Kimberly Nicholas shows that avoiding air travel is one of the most effective lifestyle changes to reduce personal emissions and help meet climate goals. So in this study, they calculated that avoiding one transatlantic flight saves approximately 1.6 tons of CO2 emissions. And according to the 1.5 degrees lifestyle report, per person emissions needs to be limited to 2.5 tons per person and year by 2030. So as you can see illustrated in the image here, that leaves very little room for air travel, since only one transatlantic flight eats up a large amount of the personal carbon budget. So while reducing air travel is necessary to meet climate goals, previous research shows that there has been resistance among travelers to change their air travel behaviors and fly less. And several factors have been pointed out in the literature as explanations to this. So first of all, flying has become a social norm for a growing group of people. And air travel is also often less affected by environmental attitudes. So this then makes flying a strong example of a value-action gap. And for many travelers, flying is perceived, or it has become perceived as an integral part of life and part of the identity of travelers. So this also makes flying particularly resistant to change. But despite this general resistance to fly less, a movement to reduce air travel has emerged in Sweden during recent years. This movement is now challenging the idea of flying as a social norm and contributing to changing narratives of air travel and climate change. So for instance, the flight chain narrative, which has gained a lot of attention in Swedish news media lately and also in international media, but also more encouraging narratives of the personal benefits and value gains of flying less. So what we can see then is that the discourse of air travel as a social norm is being increasingly challenged and problematized by this movement. And this is what we focus on in our study. So what we have done is that we have analyzed this recent problematization of air travel and the emergence of this movement to stay on the ground from the perspective of changing holiday travel discourse. So looking at how this movement is contributing to new attitudes and ideas towards air travel. So we asked, how has the discourse of holiday air travel changed in Sweden since the 1950s and onwards? And what shifts in values and narratives are illustrated by this discursive development? And the second question here is then related to the stories that we tell about air travel and how these stories have changed. So to analyze this, we combined methods of archival research and qualitative media analysis. So in a first step of data collection, we collected a sample of advertisements, images, and texts from four large Swedish travel magazines covering different periods of time from the 1950s and onwards. So we did this. This was done in a physical archive, and we collected source. We looked for sources that in different ways articulated notions and ideas about holiday air travel. And we also collected additional material from digital archives, such as the SAS Museum's image archive. And in the second step, we focused on this recent problematization of air travel in Swedish news media. And we looked at the media since that has been a key site for initiating and circulating new ideas about staying on the ground and avoiding air travel. So we collected a selection of articles through keyword searches in the 4 largest Swedish newspapers using the media archive database retriever. And the initial query resulted in 420 articles, which were screened by title and introduction, limited to 91 articles. And out of these, we collected a rather small sample of 19 articles for in-depth analysis. These articles were selected based on the extent to which they illustrated new ideas and narratives of staying on the ground. So, as I said, the sample is small, and it is not an exhaustive material. So it is rather meant to be representative and illustrative of the different narratives articulated by staying on the ground. And then to analyze the material, we were inspired by a Foucauldian approach to discourse analysis, in the sense that we looked particularly for discursive changes and the way in which narratives have evolved in relation to these discursive changes. So I will not go into depth to that now, because I want to move on to the analysis, but you can ask me questions about that later on if you want to hear more about the more theoretical approach. But we coded the material in NVivo in 2 steps. So first we identified key discourses on holiday air travel, and then we identified recurring themes illustrating changing narratives and values. So moving on to the result, we identified 3 discourses on holiday air travel, and these are aspirational luxury, hypermobility, and staying on the ground. And the years here are approximate, and the discourses overlap to various extents. So for instance, hypermobility discourse and staying on the ground is very much present discourses at the moment. So I will just briefly go through the main features of these 3 discourses. So in the 50s, or more towards the end of the 50s, package tours made air travel accessible for a larger Swedish group in Sweden. So this is why we start from the 50s, since this is when more people started to fly, although flying was very much perceived as a luxury experience, which people often saved money for during long periods of time to afford. And then towards the 1990s, travel patterns changed dramatically, with people flying more frequently and often for shorter periods of time. And one of the reasons for this is that air travel has become considerably cheaper. So for instance, during the past 20 years, the user price for air transport has dropped with more than 50%. And this has then given rise to a new norm of cheap and excessive air travel. And this norm is now being challenged by the staying on the ground movement, which consists of people pledging to stay on the ground for the sake of the climate. And this movement is also orchestrating new narratives around the recognition that flying less is critical to meet climate goals. And in a second step of the analysis, we identified 5 themes illustrating changing narratives in relation to these 3 discourses. So to trace these narrative transformations within each theme, we formulated a number of empirical questions. So the themes are aviation, holiday experiences, time, the good life, and climate change. So what we asked was, we looked first at the role of holiday air travel for holiday experiences, and then we looked at the ideas and ideals about holidaying, so which ideas that have been dominant and the purpose with holiday air travel. Then we looked at how notions of time are understood in relation to air travel, holiday experiences, and climate change. And we looked at in what ways holiday air travel is an expression of the good life. And lastly, we looked at how climate change is perceived in relation to holiday air travel. So I will go through each theme and show some illustrations from our material. When it comes to the role of aviation, flying was very clearly considered an important part of the journey when leisure air travel emerged as a holiday trend. And as you can see in this SAS advert from the 60s, air travel was very much sold as something comfortable and luxurious. And then as narratives of aviation, or as aviation has become more of a norm and something that more people is doing, flying has also become perceived more as a mode of transportation rather than part of the holiday. And towards the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, travel advertisements started to focus a lot on cheap air travel, which is a key aspect of the hypermobility discourse. And staying on the ground challenges this idea of cheap and excessive or accessible air travel and portrays aviation as a climate enemy and something that needs to be avoided or even abandoned, as you can see illustrated in this opinion piece to the right here, written by the leader of the Swedish flight-free movement, saying that abandoning air travel is important to save the climate. And then the next thing we analyzed was in regard to the purpose with holiday air travel. So from the 50s until more or less the end of the 20th century, package tours was the main holiday trend among Swedes, and these trips were and are still very much focused on rest and relaxation as the main purpose. The destination here was not the most important as long as it offered sun, sea, and a relaxing environment for recharging from everyday life. And package tours are still popular in Sweden, but tour operators are now facing increasing competitions as new or other travel trends have emerged. So while rest and relaxation is still an important focus of holiday travel, trips have also become more focused on activities. So a trend of activity-based travel has also emerged. And another example is the around the world trip, which became popular in the 90s and was advertised in travel magazines as something that everyone is doing or dream of doing. And this was also followed by a trend of shorter weekend trips. So these trends then reflect an increasing desire to explore the world and to see many new places and to become a more active traveler rather than just traveling to the sun and relax. And staying on the ground counter this idea of rapidly exploring the world and brings forth other values of traveling in a slower way and exploring holiday destinations closer to home. And during the last few years, the trend of slow travel in particular has been picked up also by Swedish travel magazines. With Vagabond, for instance, one of the largest travel magazines in Sweden at the moment, having published 2 special issues on train vacations since 2018. So what we can say is also that staying on the ground reflects kind of a value shift from more global values to local values, with also this trend of staycation and exploring holiday destinations closer to home. As the discourse of holiday air travel has transformed, notions of time has also changed. So when flying was a luxury aspiration, time was articulated mainly in 2 ways. So first of all, or on the one hand, as personal time in the sense of the time that you would save by flying. So air travel is something that makes your vacation longer since you reach the destination faster. But then also in terms of the relationship between time and space, so portraying air travel as something that shrinks the world, as flying brings distant and exotic places closer to home and reachable in the same amount of time as, for instance, the Swedish summer house. And And as air travel has become more of a norm for a growing group of people, the notion of time has become more centered around the idea of making the most of the one's personal time. So, for instance, planning the trip in the right way, seeing many places, exploring many countries, and so on. And time is also a central aspect of staying on the ground, but more than articulated in relation to climate change. So staying on the ground very clearly articulates a narrative of urgency in the sense that we need to act now and change our behaviors now in order to meet climate goals. So this is illustrated in the opinion piece here to the right, where the author says, in the acute climate crisis, we now choose not to fly. When it comes to narratives of the good life, this was articulated, so when flying was a luxury experience, holiday air travel was very much portrayed as something that enriches life and that makes life better, also placing a lot of focus on the activity of traveling. Which is also linked then to air travel being an important part of the journey. And then as flying has become a norm for more people, narratives of the good life have become more centered around holiday air travel as a natural part of life. So focus has shifted from the activity of traveling to being a traveler, so to the subject of the traveler, with traveling becoming part of people's identities. For instance, with people becoming backpackers and going on inter-flight trips, which was a popular trend during the 90s. And staying on the ground, on the other hand, contributes to redefine ideas about what a good life is, for instance, by shifting focus towards more local values and also illustrating a desire of slowing down life's pace in general. And then lastly, when it comes to climate change, narratives of environmental change especially was articulated already in the 80s as ecotourism emerged as a new holiday trend to cope with the environmental hazards linked to mass tourism. And the solution by them was not portrayed as reduced tourism or air travel, but rather as inventing a new form of tourism. And then later on, carbon offsetting has also emerged as a trend within the hypermobility discourse, as you can see, for instance, in this travel magazine advert with carbon offsetting being sold directly in the airplane. And then with the emergence of staying on the ground, narratives of climate change have been reformulated to something close and personal rather than distant and abstract. And the critique around air travel is very much centered around the CO2 emissions and global warming impacts associated with air travel, rather than, for instance, the backsides of tourism. And the solution here is very clearly defined as avoiding air travel. And in this opinion piece by Jens Liljestrand with the headline, "I'm tired of showing my child a dying world," this piece illustrates a narrative of holiday air travel being an unreasonable activity considering its contribution to climate change, and also refer to leisure air travel here as the most expensive suicide in history. Okay, I will wrap up quickly. So what we can see is that the discourse of air travel as an aspirational luxury articulates narratives of holiday air travel as something that most people dream of and desire, and air travel is here perceived as very luxurious, and there's a lot of focus on flying as such. Whereas as air travel has become more accessible, it has also become perceived as less aspirational, as less luxurious, but not necessarily less aspirational. So it has been turned into a norm, but it's still something that people aspire and long for. And the discourse of hypermobility captures this shift and articulates the idea of air travel as a natural part of life. So in this way, this discourse is shaping people into becoming frequent flyers and moves focus from the activity of traveling to the subject of the traveler. And staying on the ground, then, on the other hand, revolves on a number of counter-narratives that challenge the idea of flying as a social norm by formulating values of time, holiday experiences, and notions of what constitutes a good life in a carbon-constrained world. And these narratives are orchestrated by people who are making active choices to mitigate their own emissions by staying grounded. That's also shifting focus from the hypermobile and global values that have been, or global ideals, which have been dominant in the last decades, towards more local values. And I see that my time is running out, so I'm going to stop there and we can discuss more soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation and this travel along the holiday travel. We have several questions from the audience. One is from Agnes Krill. As you were searching, did you come across articles that discuss business travel too? And if so, could you share your impression of how those developed in Sweden?
Okay, so I guess this question is focused on the media analysis. And so the reason why I focused on holiday air travel was that at least holiday air travel accounts for the majority of the emissions from air travel comes from leisure flying, so almost 80% of all air travel emissions. So that's why I focused on holiday air travel. And then when it comes to the media analysis, yes, well, I would say more that those articles, many of those articles are not explicitly focused on either business travel or holiday air travel. So it's more about air travel in general. At least when it comes to the movement to stay on the ground, they do not really differentiate between holiday air travel and business travel. So yes, I came across articles focused on business travel, but if the articles were focused on only business travel, I didn't include them in my sample.
And a second question from Francis, that she has been active in the chat. In how far do you feel that there is a consensus among the Swedish population on flight scam? Is the competition with the hypermobility narrative strong?
Sorry, can you repeat the last thing? If the competition with the
hypermobility narrative is strong?
Okay. So yeah, I wouldn't say that there is a consensus among Swedes when it comes to flyg scam. And so one thing is also when it comes to the movement to stay on the ground, so the social movement to stay on the ground, they are not explicitly articulating a narrative of flight shame. And flight shame is a narrative which has been articulated a lot in Swedish news media, and also that's the narrative that has spread most abroad. But when it comes to the movement to stay on the ground, they are not particularly focusing on shame, so they are focusing more on also other more encouraging narratives of as I mentioned, also the personal benefits of staying on the ground. So I wouldn't say there is absolutely not a consensus among Swedes when it comes to flyg scam. And then the second part of that question, if it conflicts a lot with the hypermobility discourse, yes, I mean, of course, so the hypermobility discourse, within that discourse of that narrative, flying is a natural part of life. So it is something that it's almost that we cannot really imagine life without flying. And when it comes to flight shame, that narrative is challenging the main ideas of hypermobility by articulating ideas of flying as something shameful and that we shouldn't be doing.
In this sense, Jeroen is asking, is there evidence that Swiss people substitute flying by car-based holidays? And are there the estimates of how much carbon rebound they generate?
But, sorry, could you repeat?
So in the same, Jeroen Vandenberg is asking you, is there evidence that Swedish people substitute flying by car-based holidays?
Okay, now I can also read the question here. So what we can say is that a growing number of people in Sweden are flying less because of climate change. But then if they are substituting it by car-based holidays, no, I don't think there is any evidence for that. But what we can say is that, or what we can see is that last year flying decreased among Swedes. and train increased. So I would rather say that flying is substituted by train travel, but I don't have any evidence for that.
We have an last questions, a few seconds from Joel. Can you elaborate how this narrative coexist and compete?
Yeah, let's see. Yes, I would say, for instance, I mean, yeah, so the hypermobility narratives within the hypermobility discourse and narratives within staying on the ground, these discourses are very much competing. So staying on the ground is all the time challenging and like challenging the narratives within hypermobility. So I would say that those discourses very clearly coexist and compete. And then when it comes to aspirational luxury and hypermobility and the narratives within those discourses, so as I see it, the discourse of aspirational luxury is not, I mean, aspects of that or narratives within that discourse might still be present today and coexist with hypermobility, for instance, or staying on the ground, but it's not as present since flying has become more, like in Sweden at least, it has become a norm for a growing group of people, so it is not considered as a luxury experience in the same sense as it did in the 50s and 60s, for instance, when people started to fly and it was perceived very much as a comfortable luxury that you can do maybe once in a lifetime. But yes, the narratives coexist and compete. They do.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I encourage to continue the discussion on the discussion.